They have never met someone like you, and that sentence isn't flattery, it's psychology, because their nervous system has been trained by years of emotional distance, learned self-reliance, and the quiet belief that closeness always comes with a cost. So when you entered their life, you didn't feel exciting in the way they were conditioned to recognize. You felt unfamiliar in a deeper way, like calm in a body that only knows how to brace. And the first thing that happened wasn't attraction, but confusion, because you didn't arrive with urgency. You didn't rush intimacy. You didn't scan them for reassurance. You didn't lean forward emotionally trying to pull something out of them. You simply showed up as yourself, steady and present, and that alone disrupted the internal map they use to navigate relationships. Because avoidant psychology is built around predictability, not safety. And they can predict chaos, they can predict intensity, they can predict people who need them or want more than they can give. But they cannot predict someone who feels grounded without being distant, open without being invasive, interested without being demanding. So before they ever thought, I like this person, their body asked a more threatening question. Why don't I feel the need to defend myself right now? And that question lingered beneath every interaction. Because calm is not neutral to someone who learned that love comes with pressure. Calm feels like the eye of a storm, where something must be wrong. So in the beginning, they watched you closely, not because they wanted to get closer, but because they were waiting for the moment you would reveal the familiar pattern. The moment you would need more, ask for reassurance, demand consistency, push for clarity, but you didn't, and that absence of pressure was the first thing that set you apart. Because their nervous system associates attachment with obligation, and you didn't feel like an obligation, you felt like a choice. And choice is terrifying to someone who survives by avoiding emotional debt. Because if they choose you, they can't blame you later for needing to escape. And that's where the second shift happened. Quietly, internally, without words, because you didn't need to be needed. You weren't trying to earn closeness by proving your value. You weren't positioning yourself as indispensable. You didn't collapse when they were quiet. You didn't overfunction when they pulled back. You continued to live your life, to laugh, to remain emotionally intact. And that independence didn't make them feel safe in the way detachment does. It made them feel exposed. Because avoidants are comfortable when they are the more distant one, when they hold the emotional leverage, when the other person's neediness confirms their belief that closeness is something people demand rather than something they offer freely. But you inverted that dynamic without trying, by choosing them without depending on them. And that subtle difference struck a nerve they didn't know existed, because it challenged a core belief that love always requires sacrifice of self. And here you were, loving without disappearing, connected without clinging. And that forced their mind into unfamiliar territory, because if you don't need them, then their presence actually matters. Not as a function, not as a role, but as a person. And that kind of significance is heavier than obligation, because it can't be escaped by withdrawal. And then came the moment they realized something else was different about you, something even more destabilizing. You saw them, not the version they present to stay in control, not the competent exterior or the emotional minimalism, but the contradictions beneath it, the tenderness they hide, the exhaustion behind their independence, fear they never name. And you saw it without trying to fix it, without labeling it, without turning it into a problem that needed solving. And that may sound small, but to someone with avoidant wiring, being seen usually comes with conditions, advice, or expectations. And you offered none of that. You didn't interpret their distance as something you caught. You didn't chase their vulnerability. You didn't corner them emotionally. You allowed their inner world to exist without commentary, and that felt both relieving and threatening. Relieving because for once they weren't being managed, and threatening because they weren't being misunderstood either. And misunderstanding is safer than accurate perception, because when someone truly understands you, your defenses become visible. And that visibility triggers fear, not because you might leave, but because you might stay and see too much. And yet, even then, you didn't push, you didn't lean in harder. When you sensed depth, you didn't demand reciprocity in emotional labor. You let intimacy remain optional. And that is one of the rarest experiences for an avoidant, because their entire system is organized around escaping forced closeness. And when closeness is optional, when they can approach without being pulled, something unexpected happens. Their guard lowers without conscious decision. They share more than they planned. They linger longer than intended. They return without being summoned, and they don't notice it happening until after. And this is where the fourth shift took place. Because your presence didn't require performance. They didn't have to be charming or distant or impressive or aloof. They didn't have to regulate your emotions or manage your expectations. They could be quiet without explanation, expressive without consequence, inconsistent without punishment. And instead of chaos following those moments, there was still calm, and that contradicted everything their past taught them. Because historically, inconsistency leads to conflict, withdrawal leads to pursuit, silence leads to pressure. But with you, silence led to space. Space led to reflection. And reflection led to awareness. And awareness is dangerous for avoidance because once they become aware of how they function, they can no longer pretend their patterns are neutral. And then something even more unsettling occurred. They pulled away as they always do, not dramatically, just subtly delayed response, a little more distance, a soft disappearance, expecting the familiar response, the questions, the reaching, the emotional escalation, but it didn't come, you didn't punish them with coldness, you didn't chase them with anxiety, you didn't demand reassurance or explanations. You stayed grounded, you maintained your boundaries without anger, and that moment landed harder than any confrontation ever could, because distance usually gives them relief, but this time it gave them something else, a strange, hollow quiet, not peace, not freedom, but absence. And that was the first time they felt the difference between space and loss. And that distinction is crucial because avoidant psychology thrives on the belief that distance equals safety. But you disrupted that equation by remaining whole and self-respecting. You removed the illusion that pulling away always leads to comfort. And that realization didn't arrive as a thought. It arrived as a sensation, a low-level unease, a subtle awareness that something valuable existed without demanding them, and that value could be lost without drama, without chaos, without a fight. And that is when the emotional attachment truly began. Not in closeness, but in the quiet recognition that you were different. Not because you stayed no matter what, but because you didn't need to. And that combination of choice, calm, and clarity is something they have never encountered before. And it unsettles them more deeply than any intense connection ever has. Because intensity can be escaped, but grounded presence leaves a mark. And even if they never say it, even if they rate again, their nervous system has now experienced a new blueprint. One where love does not equal pressure, where intimacy does not erase autonomy, and where someone can feel like home without demanding they give themselves up. And once that blueprint exists, it cannot be unseen. And that is why they have never met someone like you. What happens next doesn't look dramatic on the surface, and that's why most people miss it. But internally, something has shifted, and the avoidant feels it long before they understand it. Because once their nervous system has tasted safety without pressure, it becomes harder to return to emotional numbness without consequence. And this is where the unfamiliar tension begins. Because you didn't trigger their fear through intensity, you triggered it through steadiness. And steadiness forces confrontation, not with you, but with themselves. Because when nothing is wrong externally, all that's left is what they've been avoiding internally. And that's when they begin to notice something subtle, yet destabilizing. They start thinking about you when you're not there, not in a dramatic longing way, but in quiet flashes. Moments where your calm response replays in their mind. Moments where they expected judgment and received understanding instead. Moments where they anticipated pressure and felt freedom. And these moments accumulate, slowly, silently, until you become associated not with excitement, but with regulation. And regulation is intimate in a way they were never taught how to handle, because their history trained them to bond through adrenaline, through push and pull, through emotional highs and lows that kept them alert. But you didn't activate that system, you soothed it, and paradoxically, soothing feels unsafe to someone whose identity is built around emotional self-containment. Because if they relax, they risk feeling things they've locked away for years. So instead of leaning in, they hesitate, they intellectualize, they distance again. But this time, the distancing doesn't fully work because you didn't disappear from their internal world. And that's new because usually when they pull back, the emotional cord snaps, relief follows and they return to equilibrium. But with you, the cord doesn't snap, it stretches, and that stretch creates discomfort because part of them wants to retreat to familiarity, while another part, a quieter part they don't trust yet, feels drawn to the safety you represent. And this internal split is exhausting because it requires awareness, and awareness demands energy. And avoidance conserve energy by keeping things shallow, predictable, and controlled. But you made depth feel natural, unforced, and that is why you activated something. They had successfully suppressed longing, not the dramatic kind that seeks fulfillment, but the quiet kind that whispers, this could be different. And that whisper scares them more than loneliness ever did. Because loneliness is familiar, longing is not. And then comes the moment they start to feel attached, without writing, not through grand gestures or emotional declarations, but through mundane realizations, like noticing they want to tell you something that happened during their day, or feeling a subtle disappointment when you're unavailable, or checking their phone, not out of anxiety, but out of curiosity. And these moments catch them off guard because attachment was never supposed to form this way, without intensity, without dependency, without loss of control. And yet there it is, growing quietly in the background, and instead of feeling trapped, they feel unsettled, because attachment without obligation removes their usual excuse to leave. They can't say they were pressured. They can't say they were overwhelmed. They can't say they lost themselves because you never asked them to give anything up. And that lack of justification forces them to confront a question they've avoided their entire life. If I walk away from this, what am I actually running from? And that question is dangerous because it points inward, not outward. And avoidant psychology survives by externalizing discomfort, blaming timing, circumstances, or incompatibility, but you didn't give them those easy exits because you were compatible without being consuming, present without being invasive, emotionally available without being needy, and then something even more disorienting happens. Your absence starts to feel different, not dramatic, not painful in a sharp way, but hollow, like a quiet room after a familiar sound has stopped. And that hollow feeling doesn't demand action. It just exists. And because it exists without chaos, they can't dismiss it as anxiety. They can't label it as dysfunction. They have to sit with it. And sitting with feelings is not something they're practiced at. Because historically, feelings led to overwhelm. So they learn to detach early, but this feeling doesn't overwhelm them. It lingers, and lingering feelings require acknowledgement. And acknowledgement requires honesty, and honesty threatens their self-concept because they see themselves as independent, unaffected, self-sufficient, and yet here they are, affected, not in a way that compromises them, but in a way that humanizes them. And that's when the internal narrative begins to shift. Slowly, reluctantly, they start comparing, not consciously at first, but experientially. Interactions with others feel louder, more demanding, more chaotic, even if those people are kind, because once your nervous system calibrates to calm, chaos becomes obvious, and they don't like that realization because it means they can no longer pretend that all connections are equally draining. They have experienced one that wasn't. And that experience becomes a reference point, a standard they didn't ask for, but now carry. And this is where avoidance intensifies. Because when something threatens a long-held belief, the instinct is to retreat, to create distance, to restore the old equilibrium. And they may do that. They may become less responsive, more logical, more focused on independence, telling themselves they're just busy, just tired, just not ready. But beneath those rationalizations is fear, not of you, but of what you represent, because you represent a version of connection that doesn't align with their defenses. And defenses exist to protect old wounds, wounds that formed when closeness felt unsafe, inconsistent, or conditional. And your consistency shines a light on those wounds without touching them, and that light alone is enough to trigger flight. Because healing requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust. And trust was not a safe bet for them growing up. So they oscillate, leaning in emotionally in subtle ways, then pulling back physically or communicatively, creating a push-pull dynamic they don't fully understand themselves. And this is the part that confuses the other person the most because it feels inconsistent, but internally it's a battle between two systems, one that wants regulation and one that fears dependence. And you happen to activate both. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something different. And difference destabilizes patterns. And then comes a quiet realization that scares them more than attachment itself. They notice that when you hold your boundaries, when you don't chase or collapse, when you maintain your self-respect, they don't feel abandoned, they feel accountable. And accountability is something they've avoided by staying emotionally distant, because distance absolves responsibility. But closeness with boundaries requires presence, and presence means they can no longer hide behind ambiguity. And that awareness makes them feel seen in a way that doesn't shame them, but doesn't excuse them either. And that combination is rare because most people either over accommodate or over confront. And you did neither. And because you didn't, they began to see themselves more clearly, their patterns, their withdrawals, their avoidance of depth, not as personality traits, but as coping mechanisms. And once coping mechanisms are recognized, they lose some of their power. And that loss of power is terrifying because it means change is possible, and change threatens identity. And this is where many avoidants retreat fully, not because they don't care, but because caring without hiding feels too exposed. And yet, even if they retreat, something fundamental has already happened. Their nervous system has learned that intimacy does not have to equal loss of self. That connection can exist without collapse, that someone can be close without demanding ownership, and that lesson embeds itself beneath conscious thought, shaping future interactions, altering expectation. And even if they never come back, even if they never articulate it, you remain the reference point. The quiet comparison, the moment their body remembers what calm felt like. And that memory changes them, whether they admit it or not. Because once someone experiences a new emotional blueprint, the old one can never fully satisfy again. And that is why meeting you was not just another connection for them. It was a disruption, a mirror, and a possibility they didn't know it hold yet. After that internal disruption, something subtle but irreversible takes place. Because even if they pull away again, even if they convince themselves that distance is the right choice, their nervous system has already logged you as different. And avoidant psychology is deeply embodied, meaning they may rationalize with logic, but their body remembers what felt safe. And that memory resurfaces in unexpected ways, like a sudden heaviness when they consider fully letting go, or a quiet resistance when they imagine replacing you with someone else. Because what you offered wasn't excitement that fades, it was regulation that integrates. And once regulation is experienced, the body begins to crave it, even if the mind resists. And this is where the suppressed longing becomes more pronounced, not as desperation, not as obsession, but as a background ache, a sense that something meaningful exists just outside their comfort zone. And longing is dangerous for avoidance because it threatens the illusion of self-sufficiency. It reminds them that independence was a strategy, not a preference. And that realization carries grief, grief for what they didn't receive, grief for how early they had to grow up emotionally, grief for the parts of themselves they learned to shut down to survive. And being around you brushed against that grief without forcing it open. And that gentle contact made it harder to ignore because you didn't demand emotional excavation. You simply existed in a way that invited honesty without pressure. And honesty, even internal honesty, changes people so they begin to notice their own patterns more clearly. The way they intellectualize feelings, the way they delay responses to regain control, the way they downplay attachment to avoid vulnerability, and instead of feeling justified, they feel exposed, not by you, but by contrast. Because your consistency highlights their inconsistency. Your emotional clarity highlights their avoidance, and this contrast isn't shaming, but it is confronting because it removes the narrative that this is just how relationships are, and replaces it with a quieter truth. This is how I've learned to cope. And coping strategies feel safe until they're outgrown, and then they feel limiting, and that tension creates internal pressure because part of them wants to grow toward the connection you represent, while another part fears that growth will cost them their autonomy, their identity, their emotional equilibrium. And this is where the push pull intensifies, not as manipulation, but as confusion, because they don't know how to integrate closeness without losing themselves. And yet you showed them a glimpse of that possibility, not through words, but through experience. And experience is harder to dismiss than theory. And then comes a moment they rarely admit, even to themselves: comparison. They start noticing how other connections feel in their body, how conversations feel louder, more draining, more transactional, how expectations feel heavier, how emotional exchanges feel like negotiations rather than natural flow. And even if those people are kind, even if those connections are functional, something feels off because their nervous system now recognizes a difference. And once that recognition exists, it quietly reorders their priorities because they realize they felt more themselves around you, not more fused, not more dependent, but more authentic. And authenticity is intimate in a way performance never is, because it doesn't require effort, and effortlessness and connection is rare for avoidance because they're used to managing impressions, maintaining distance, regulating others' expectations. But with you, they didn't have to do that. And that absence of management created space. And space allowed them to feel, and feeling without overwhelm is transformative because it contradicts the belief that emotions are dangerous, and that contradiction destabilizes the foundation of avoidance. And then something even quieter happens. They begin to replay moments, not the dramatic ones, but the ordinary ones, the calm responses, the lack of pressure, the way you didn't react when they expected you to. And these replays aren't nostalgic, they're evaluative because their system is trying to understand why this connection didn't follow the usual script. And in doing so, they begin to see that you didn't activate their defenses in the way others did. You bypass them not intentionally, but naturally by being regulated yourself, and regulated people are threatening to dysregulated systems because they invite co-regulation, and co-regulation requires trust, and trust requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is the very thing they learn to avoid to stay safe. And yet, with you, vulnerability didn't feel like collapse, it felt like presence. And presence felt grounding, not consuming. And that realization lingers, shaping their internal world, even if they never externalize it. And this is where they struggle the most because they can't categorize you. You don't fit into their usual boxes. You weren't anxious. You weren't avoidant. You weren't demanding. You weren't distant. You existed outside their familiar relational roles. And when someone doesn't fit the roles, the system doesn't know how to respond, so it oscillates, reaching out, then retreating, idealizing, then minimizing, because the mind seeks familiarity, even if familiarity hurts. And yet, even as they minimize the connection, telling themselves it wasn't that deep, that it wouldn't have worked, that timing was off, their body disagrees because their body remembers how regulated it felt, how calm, how natural. And that disagreement between mind and body creates cognitive dissonance, and dissonance demands resolution, but resolution requires honesty, and honesty requires confronting fear. And fear is what avoidance is built to manage. And this is the paradox you introduced into their life. By not trying to change them, you made change possible. By not demanding closeness, you revealed their fear of it. By not needing them, you showed them that connection doesn't have to be transactional. And that realization is both liberating and terrifying because it means the walls they built are no longer protecting them from harm. They're protecting them from an intimacy in its healthiest form doesn't threaten autonomy, it enhances it. And even if they're not ready to accept that yet, even if they retreat again, even if they choose familiarity over growth, the seed has been planted, and seeds don't disappear. They lie dormant, influencing future choices, shaping reactions, altering expectations, And that is why meeting you was not neutral, it was formative, because you didn't just enter their life, you entered their internal map of relationships and rewrote a few quiet rules. And once those rules are rewritten, the old patterns never feel quite the same again. At this stage, whether you are present or not, something permanent has already taken root, because avoidants don't forget experiences that contradict their survival strategy. They suppress them, rationalize them, minimize them, but they don't erase them, and you became that contradiction. The proof that closeness does not automatically mean loss of self. And this realization doesn't make them suddenly brave or emotionally fluent. It makes them conflicted, because growth feels like danger to a nervous system that equates safety with distance. And that conflict shows up in ways that are often misunderstood: hesitation, inconsistency, delayed action, not because they don't care, but because caring now carries weight. And weight implies responsibility. And responsibility means they can no longer hide behind ambiguity. And ambiguity has always been their refuge. So when they think about you, it's not always longing they feel. Sometimes it's discomfort, because you represent a mirror they didn't ask to look into, a mirror that reflects both possibility and limitation. And that reflection makes avoidance harder to justify, because once someone shows you that intimacy can be calm, the old story that relationships are overwhelming starts to crack, and cracks demand explanation, and explanations lead back to the self. And the self holds memories they've been running from, unmet needs, early emotional self-reliance, moments where closeness felt unpredictable or unsafe. And you didn't cause those memories, you simply created enough safety for them to surface. And safety without pressure is a powerful catalyst, because it doesn't force healing, it invites it, and invitations are harder to reject outright. They linger, they wait, and even if the avoidant chooses distance again, that invitation remains in the background of their life, influencing how they perceive future connections. Because after you, intensity without safety feels empty, and distance without meaning feels lonely. And they begin to notice, even if they don't articulate it, they notice how often they're comparing sensations rather than people, how often they're checking in with their body instead of their logic, because your presence taught their system something new. That calm can be intimate, and intimacy can be spacious. And that lesson reshapes perception at a level deeper than conscious preference. And this is where regret sometimes emerges, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, in moments of stillness, in quiet nights, in interactions that feel hollow by comparison. And regret for an avoidant doesn't always sound like "I miss them." It often sounds like something is missing, because naming attachment feels too vulnerable. But the absence speaks anyway. And then there is the realization that arrives too late, not because you left abruptly, but because you left respectfully, without chaos, without emotional debris, without trying to make them feel guilty or wrong. And that kind of ending is haunting, because there's no villain to blame, no explosion to point to, just a quiet sense that something valuable was allowed to walk away. And that awareness settles differently than heartbreak. It settles like accountability. And accountability is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. And even if they never reach out, even if they never repair, that awareness stays with them, shaping future behavior, sometimes softening them, sometimes hardening them, depending on how willing they are to face it. But either way, you become a reference point, the relationship they think about when they wonder if they are capable of more, the connection they remember when they feel the urge to retreat. The example that proves their pattern is not the only option, and that is a heavy thing to carry, because it means they can no longer claim ignorance. And ignorance was protective, and now it's gone. And finally, there is the truth they rarely voice, not to others, and often not to themselves, that they have met attraction before, intensity before, even attachment, but they have never met someone who felt like home without demanding ownership, someone who offered closeness without erasing autonomy, someone who stayed regulated instead of reactive, someone who chose them without needing them. And that combination is rare, because it requires emotional maturity self-respect, and inner stability. And that is why you affected them so deeply, not because you chased, not because you proved your worth, not because you endured mistreatment, but because you remained yourself. And that authenticity exposed both their fear and their capacity. And even if they never fully step into that capacity, they know it exists now. And knowing that changes everything. Because once the nervous system learns a new way to experience connection, the old way never fully satisfies again. And that is the quiet, lasting impact of being someone they had never met before, someone who didn't try to save them, fix them, or force them, but simply showed them through presence alone that love does not have to hurt to be real.